We are Mary Ellen Humphrey,
Hello.
and I am Susan Landrigan. We're coming to you from the Innovation Studio at Lakeshore Center for the Arts in Westfield, New York. Today we're going to talk about research and how adding details enhances your story.
Yes, well, this is something that kind of comes after you do your first draft, usually. Not always. Sometimes people do a lot of research before they write, but I'll do it the way I do it. And the way I do it is I have a story and I write the story, and then I do the revision. And during the revision process, I find interesting information that enhances the story, but also with the purpose of bringing the reader there, putting them in the story, grounding them. I did bring a couple of examples to talk about to sort of share how you might do that if you're writing a story. And I know you're writing a story. At what time and place does your story take place?
My story takes place in the 80s and 90s.
Okay.
And it takes place in a place I've never been, so I had to do research to
Okay.
find out about that particular
Right.
city.
And what sort of things did you find out?
Well, what is they have to have a college there. What's the name of the community college?
Okay.
What is the name of the banks there?
Okay.
What else? I had to look up things in the area to make the story, where people would have been.
Right. So this book that I wrote many years ago, called Faith, is a novel that takes place in the late 60s and early 70s. And when I wrote the book, of course, I had the story. But what makes it real and believable in this fictional woods that we walk through are pieces that anchor it. So one of the things I did in this book is I went back and I looked at what were the top 10 songs on the radio. And back in the 60s and 70s, everybody listened to the radio, right? It was like the big thing. Today would be something different. But and then I specifically identified some song, just a couple. I didn't need a whole bunch, but something that would put someone back into that time and place. So if you think about it, if you hear a song that you knew when you were younger, it kind of takes you back to that
It does,
moment.
yes.
And that was one of the things that I did with this particular book. And and thinking about your book too, it's kind of interesting to see, like, you could go on to Google and see the roadscape. So you can get a sense of what does the main street look like? What would a pedestrian see? Is there a park nearby? Is there something about that community that everyone would recognize or most people would relate to? So even though it's not directly part of your story, you're anchoring your reader and you're giving them a sense of the whole landscape. It makes it more real. So,
So I would want people who have been to this particular city to know that some of the landmarks and things
Right.
are actually there.
right,
Yeah.
right. What's what's it famous for? Is there a pizza that's renowned for being there, or a music group that came from there? We think of Jamestown and we think of the Comedy Center and Lucille Ball and those kinds of things. And even if the reader doesn't know them, by you sharing that little piece, and it isn't a big piece, it's a little piece, they begin to feel more connected to that story. So that's one way that I would suggest for writers to add information that doesn't take away from your story, but makes it more palatable, more real to the reader. It makes that fictional story feel more connected to the reader. Now, what do you do if the setting is different, either science fiction or from the past, you're doing a historical novel or something like that? And so that's a little different. And I do have a book that I wrote, again, many years ago. It's called Norumbega. And this is a story about pre-settlement New England. And now that's an interesting thing to research because there isn't any real information. So you have to piece it together. And so this is about ships that were sailing along the coast of Maine in the late 1500s, so around 1585, pre-settlement. And what they were doing, so you start looking at the history and the conflicts between the French and the English about who was going to be the trader, who was going to have all those wonderful trees and fish and whatever was being traded. And I spent a lot of time studying what sailing across the ocean would be like.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because that's how the person gets to New England. And I also sailed on a square rigger for 6 days,
Nice.
which really gave me a real anchor myself as a writer. Okay, so here's what the ship looks like, and here's how, we slept on hammocks and bunks, and, it was very realistic, although more modern than what these ships were. And then my daughter, who had sailed on a square rigger across the ocean, shared her experiences with me. And I mean, it was pretty amazing. She would describe what it was like to see the tornadoes of water, the wind tunnels that are out there. And you can only imagine how the early sailors were very superstitious, and they would see these things and they would get scared. And so you start immersing yourself into what that time was like, and then you bring pieces of that, not a lot of it, but enough of it so that it feels real in your story. So I'll give you an example. The protagonist of this book, she becomes a cabin boy. She's a girl, but she becomes a cabin boy. And what did a cabin boy do? What were the jobs? And what I didn't know is that these old ships, one of the things that was really a challenge was worms would get into the wood. So a lot of this cabin boy's job was to constantly be oiling the wood of the ship to keep the worms from eating up the ship. There were lots of little pieces like that I could incorporate into the story and make it feel, even though I've never lived in the 1500s, make it feel like it is that time for the reader.
Yeah.
So and there's, you can pick any time, you can go back as far as you can go and find information. The books that I did the research on were, in this case, were all nonfiction. But sometimes there are books that have been written where someone else has done a lot of research. And if you read those kind of books, you kind of know some of the stuff that might be in that history. So those are two examples. And then another way that you can add information and interest to your story is how the language you pick to do descriptions or to open or to close. And I think openings and closings are the most challenging, but when you do them, the most fun, because you really want to start your story in a way that the reader's interest is piqued, their curiosity is piqued.
Yes.
And they say, this book is going to be worth reading. Right? Because, not all books are going to be appealing to everybody. And so when I was writing this book here, this is the Palimpsest Journal, and it's a collection of 3 stories. So one of the things about me that is, I don't know if everybody knows, but I'm a journaler. I've always kept journals. And journals have been a way for me to sort out my life, to plan what I want to do, to figure out things that I couldn't understand and all kinds of stuff. A journal can be healing for you. It can be a tool that helps you figure out what you want to do, all kinds of things. So I got this inspiration about this book from a word called palimpsest. And this is some funny process of how a story can come together. And I can say the same thing with Norm Baker. There were several pieces that kind of came together in my mind at the same time. I'll give you this example first. So with this book, my daughter, as I say, had sailed across the ocean on a square rigger and was telling me about it. My mother-in-law, who was a wonderful little, 4'11" French-Canadian lady, would tell these wonderful stories about how she was just so in love with her father, and how when he came home from work, she'd climb on his lap, and she was just a little bit of a thing with long curly hair, and she just had this wonderful exuberance about that experience. And so that combined for me to sort of envision the story for this one. With this book, my love of journaling was definitely a piece of it, but I came across this word, palimpsest. And palimpsest means old parchment or old paper that has been reused. So back in the Egyptians and olden days, when paper was very rare and very expensive, it was reused, it was recycled, and they would either scrape off what was on it or they would cover over it. There would be some way that they would reuse it, and that was called palimpsest. So I asked the question, what if? What if you had a journal that had been reused over and over and over for hundreds of years, and the person who gets this journal doesn't see any of the previous journals, but they start writing in it, and the journal, of course, it takes on an entity. It becomes like a person, like part of your story, that it empowers or not. It depends on how you perceive it with their life. So in the Palimpsest journal, I started with, I think, a different, unique look at something. And in this case, I wanted to open the story. I'm just going to share the first paragraph because it took me a while to come up with this. But also, it captures, I think, the essence of what's coming in the story. Okay, so it was one of those perfect New England summer days. The sky was a deep azure with a sense of endlessness, like eternity in the face of God peering into the world of mankind. Time seemed to slow, to almost come to a standstill. In moments like these, you forget that the seasons change and the wind and the rain and the snow will fall again, that Mother Nature will exert her fury and force onto the face of the land and into the face of its inhabitants. For now, for this moment on this day, it was beguilingly tranquil. So
And then, and then something happens.
Yes, and then the story. So those are some ways that I personally use to add interest to a story. And I think as we have our writers group here, we share a lot of things, and everybody has their own way. Everybody is kind of going to find a way to add this, but my advice is look for pieces of real things that you can add to your story that anchors your reader and helps them visualize what's going on.
Especially if it's a certain timeline.
Yes, especially if you're set in like I said, in the 60s, 70s, 1500s, whenever. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Good information. Let's move on to the word for the day. And the word for today is
Veridical?
veridical.
I think.
Veridical. Truthful. Tongue-tied. Coinciding with reality.
That's really interesting because I think of my Palimpsest journal. It collides with reality. Coinciding with reality. That's an interesting concept
Veridical.
for a book or for a story. Because sometimes you're searching for truth, right? That's why we write stories. A lot of times it's, well, what is true? And
There is a lot of truth sometimes in stories, unless it's like meant to be completely not true.
Right. Well, I think the truth is in the human experience. So even if it's an alien in a way off world on another planet, we as human readers are looking for our truth in that story. And I think that's part of what makes a story work. It might be a truth that is a surprise. You find the main characters find out something about themselves or something about the world or something about something. And the reader goes on that journey, and it's interesting that it coincides with reality. So I think this is a really good word for writers to think about, to kind of ponder. Yeah.
Coinciding with reality.
Yeah. I'm gonna let that roll around in my brain today.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll collide with reality.
I think the book that I'm reading is somewhat veridical.
Okay.
There's a lot of things that actually happened, but then there's things that didn't. So.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting concept in writing a story. Truthful, coinciding with reality. I think a story has to have truth to it. Whether it's a real truth or a false truth, it has to have something that
To
you
make it
identify.
believable?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we had a really nice day today.
Yes. Well, thank you for spending time with us today. We value your feedback, and we'll see you next week.
Have a good one.